Greetings, this is Dr. Faith Acker, and in this rather long video I'm going to talk you through a couple different types of sources and then show you how to cite the most basic sources that you're likely to come into contact with for your profile essay here at Southeastern. I want to start by talking about the difference between the types of sources that you might access. There are books. Here's a book. Most of you are probably familiar with books, although you might now be reading a lot of your books online. This is Robert Graves's The Greek Myths 1, and I do have Robert Graves' The Greek Myths 2, in case you were wondering. And the book it has a cover. It's reasonably thick. This is a mass market paperback, so it's smaller than my head. Most books, if you open the book up, the third or fourth leaf is going to have what we call a title page, and the title page is going to have the name of the author, the title of the book. Down at the bottom it's going to have some publication details. And on the back it's going to have the back of the title page, that is, it'll have additional publication details. If you're interested in how to find these on a page, I would recommend looking at my other video on citations, which talks you through how to find all of these in the Cross Currents textbook published by Southeastern Louisiana University. Now, if you're in college, especially this semester in 2020, as I'm making this video, you probably aren't using very many books as sources unless there are ebooks. And ebooks are also great. You can access them through the Southeastern University Library, and you can often download a chunk of the book as a PDF, and also often you can read the book online. Reading a book online, of course, comes with its own advantages and disadvantages, and they get cited slightly differently, and that's laid out for you in the Little Brown Handbook. If you end up with an ebook, I would recommend looking at those guidelines in the Little Brown Handbook, because I'm not going to go over ebooks today. What I do want to talk about today is something called a journal article, also known as a periodical. Today I've brought a few different periodicals to talk to you about. Basically, periodical is the word for anything that is printed and is released periodically. So a book will be printed usually once in a big publication push, and then if the book sells out, the publisher might choose to publish another edition of the same book, maybe updating it a little bit, maybe not, but the book is its own single press release in most instances. In contrast, a periodical plans to publish different material every designated period of time. So here I have, when I moved to Louisiana, I got a copy of the New Orleans Official Visitor's Guide for 2019. I didn't get a 2021, I don't know why. So this, I would assume, is probably released every year, and the hotel I stayed in was probably just a little outdated, maybe because of COVID, but it says 2019, so I figure it comes out every year. I also got a copy of sort of a newspaper, or an advertisement called The Gambit, and this on the top says that it came out June 30th to July 6th of 2020. It's the 41st volume and the 24th number. That date at the top tells me this is something that's probably released pretty much every week, and a new issue of The Gambit will come out and it will give me new information about material that has been released. So the period of time could be a week, it could be a month for something like National Geographic. Some journals come out every 2 months, some come out quarterly or 4 times a year, every 3 months, some come out twice a year, some are yearly, some are even every other year, and that's just going to depend on how often the periodical is released. Today we're going to talk about academic periodicals, and the first one I want to show you is called College English. And it's really important that you get a sense of this. This is a scholarly academic journal, and what that means is that there's an editor who has solicited essays that have been read independently by people who don't know the authors, or they don't know the identities of the authors, and have said these are good enough essays that they're worth printing in this pamphlet. So I don't know how easy it'll be to see on the video, but this is pretty thin, but still reasonably thick. It starts on page 365 and it runs into the 470s. So this is one of 4 publications of college English that come out quarterly. And if you can see the top of that, you can see it's volume 66, number 4, published in March 2004. In the days before JSTOR and EBSCOhost and ProQuest, this is actually how academics used to read the sorts of journal articles that you're used to searching in the library database. We actually subscribed to these, and you can see I've blocked out some of the details of the address because I don't want to share a video that has an address that belongs to one of my fine colleagues, but you can see this was actually mailed to my colleague here at Southeastern. And my colleague then probably opened this up and maybe read it over breakfast in much the same way that you might read a book or a magazine. This particular edition, much like a book, you open it up and you go a couple pages in, there's some letters to the editor, it has a table of contents, and this edition is comprised of 5 separate articles by 5 separate people that have all been independently vetted and have all been considered to be reasonably valuable. And the reason I want you to understand that this is how journals used to come, and actually, in fact, this is how journals still come, is that as you start to cite things that you find in databases, you're going to be using what the MLA calls containers. And what the containers mean is that you first cite the journal article as if it were in the journal, so that someone whose library only has a print copy of this particular journal could go to their library and find the copy of the journal and find the same article that you read, even though you read it online. Then after that, you'll give the citation details for the database that you used to find the journal, so that someone else who wants to look at the article online, much as you are going to be doing, has a way to get to an electronic copy if they don't want to have to go to the library and find the original copy. I imagine this is going to change in another 10 or 15 years as online journals and online articles become even more prolific and as more and more libraries start to divest themselves of their print holdings. But for the moment, when you cite something, first think about the original container, the way the original article looks, and then when you've finished citing the original article in its primary container, then you can add in the details that show someone how to get to that text electronically. In the next part of this video, I'm going to show you how to find some MLA citation resources in the copy of the Little Brown Handbook that you should have if you're taking a freshman composition course with me. In this semester's edition of the book, page 646 gives you an overview of the basic principles of MLA citation. If you have the book yourself, you may want to turn to page 646. Here you'll see on the page that the first piece of information you'll give for any citation will be the author's last name, followed by the author's first name, plus any other author's names following if there are also other authors. And immediately after that, you're going to include the title of the work that you're citing, whether that's a book, a short story, a journal article, or even a web page. Everything else is just details about the container in which the particular piece of information can be found. And I'd like to start by showing you how I would find the relevant information in the copy of College English that I just showed you, and then I'll show you where that same information would appear on a website. Along the way, I'll be pointing out the particular details that you would need to put into a citation of an article in College English. Here's the copy of College English I showed you earlier. You'll remember that it has about 5 articles in it, and I think that I mentioned that it doesn't actually begin on page 1. It actually begins on page 365 because it's the 4th journal in this series published in a particular year. For the rest of this video, I'm going to show you how I'd find information to cite an article in this edition of College English. First, I'm going to show it to you in the physical journal using that list of items in the container. And then I'm going to show you how I would find it on JSTOR, a database, and how I would write a works cited entry for both. I'm going to be working today on an article called Forgetful Memory and Images of the Holocaust. I'm not going to try to pronounce the author's name, but it does begin on page 380 in this edition, and it ends on page 402, just opposite a different article by Elizabeth Marshall. Most of the information that I need to cite this is actually going to be on the front of the journal. In this instance, that's not always the case, and journals, like books, usually have title pages. Here's the title page of this one, that include much of this same information. So you might need to look in 2 or 3 separate places to find the information for your particular journal article. I already know that the author's name, so I would go ahead and put the author's name, last name first, comma, first name last, period. I also already know the title of the article, Forgetful Memory and Images of the Holocaust. In this instance, because it's a short work, I would go ahead and put it in quotation marks, and really short is probably anything that's under 60 pages, so don't let that overwhelm you. In this instance, my container is the book that this article is published in, or really the journal, which happens to be called College English, and we always italicize container names because containers are always large enough to hold other texts or other works. Journals do have other contributors, and in many cases you'll be able to find them on one of the first pages of the journal. Here you'll see the editorial staff who have contributed to this edition of College English and who actually probably selflessly work on College English. A weird quirk of MLA that you would only know if you went and looked up exactly how to cite a journal article is that we actually skip the other contributors to journal articles unless they happen to be translators or illustrators. In those cases, they would still get listed as other contributors. But unlike when we cited cross currents, you won't be citing the editors of a particular journal. Instead, we're going to move right on to the version and the number, which will usually be very close to one another in the information you have about a material. At the top, you can hopefully see this is volume 66 and number 4. The volume is the version, the number is the number. Sometimes it will say edition, as when we cited our cross currents book as the 2nd edition. Other times it will be version and issue, or volume and issue. So you'll need to look around at different words that are used to indicate the version and the number. They won't always say version or number. There are a number of different words used for those. Again, kind of weirdly, even though we have a publisher for this, the National Council of Teachers of English, we don't put publishers on MLA citations for journals. So again, we're going to leave that particular piece of information off, although if you were following the MLA list of items to include and you included it, I would certainly not mark that as wrong. The last thing that you would need is the location, and because we're citing its location in this physical book, the location is actually just going to be the page ranges on which this article appears in the textbook. Here you can see I have the first page is 380, and I believe I remember my last page is 402. At the end of the container, I put a period to indicate that I've finished the particular container. If I'm just citing this copy of College English, that's all the information I need to provide. Clearly, getting to College English has been so easy for me that I can assume that anybody else who's reading my paper can probably also get to College English for themselves. However, if I access this text through a database at the library, I want to give my reader additional information, just in case my reader needs to access it through the same database, or in case my reader wants to be clear on exactly which version of the article I've read. Something electronic, for instance, is much easier to change or update than this physical book, which is basically going to have the same materials in it if anyone finds an additional copy of this book at almost any point in time. Here's the works cited entry I've just created for the article Forgetful Memory and Images of the Holocaust in College English. Note that I have periods after the author and after the title, and that all the information about the first container is separated with commas until we get to the end of this container. I've already taken the liberty of pulling up this article in JSTOR. You can see that it's giving me a little fake front page. That's not actually what the front of my College English looks like. And then it reproduces as closely as possible the actual pages of the article so that the words that are on each page in this PDF should match exactly the words that are on the pages in the copy of the journal that I just showed you physically. On JSTOR, all of the information that we used in this citation is usually provided right over here under the Information tab. So you can see that the author's name is right here. The title is up here. In larger letters, the name College English for its first container is here. It gives me the volume and the number and the date, March 2004, as well as the page ranges that the article spans in the original journal. So if I'm only accessing this online, I can use the same pieces of information all in one convenient location to find the citation details I need for my article. The other things that I'll need to acknowledge here is the fact that I've used JSTOR to access this particular article in this instance. So all of the materials in my original citation would stay the same if I'm citing this article through a database. Instead, what's really important is this period here at the end of the page range. This period shows my reader that the container of the physical journal is not the only container that I've used to create my Works Cited page. Instead, I need to acknowledge that I've accessed it through JSTOR, and I need to give my reader a clue about how to access it also. Don't forget that any container always gets italicized. In this instance, I want to think about whether any of the relevant information for a container is also evident for JSTOR. Does JSTOR have other contributors? Not in this instance, although sometimes a container like Crosscurrents might. Does it have a particular version? Not really. JSTOR has stayed pretty steady. I might want to include the years in which JSTOR is copyrighted, but in this instance I'm not going to because that's not really traditional for JSTOR, but it certainly wouldn't be wrong to include. The most important piece of information I'm going to give my reader, however, is its alternate location. And in this instance, JSTOR gives me two particular pieces of information. It gives me a DOI, which is the word we use for Digital Object Identifier. And the great thing about a DOI is that it's standard across all databases. So if you happened to find this article in a completely different database, it would still have the DOI. It's sort of like a digital tag that tells you this is always the same article. The other thing that JSTOR provides is something called a stable URL. And if you don't have a DOI, you'll want to include the stable URL instead. It's not wrong to include the stable URL, but sometimes even stable URLs can change, whereas the point of a DOI is that it is in theory, it's pretty new, so this could change, but it is in theory supposed to stay constant across all texts and all platforms. In this instance, because I have a DOI, I'm just going to type in DOI and then a little colon, and then I'm going to copy and paste my DOI right here so that my reader knows where I found this particular piece of information. Again, if I didn't have a DOI, I would be using this wonderful stable URL instead. And in many cases, the articles and texts that you cite are not going to have a DOI, and you'll want to cite a stable URL instead. I also want you to know that if you use an article on JSTOR, you can click on this button, Download PDF. They provide all of this citation material right up at the very beginning. So here's my author, my title, my first container, my volume, my number, my date, my page ranges. I even have the publisher, although I don't need it. JSTOR is going to be at the bottom of this page down here, and then the stable URL. They do not give me the DOI. If you had the PDF, you wouldn't need to go back in and get the DOI. Again, you can use a URL instead. Now I have all of my information. My Works Cited entry starts with my author's name, last name first, first name last with a comma in between, ending with a period. I use quotation marks around the title of my short article. My first container, the journal in which it first appeared, is italicized, followed by a comma, like every other detail about this container. I have the volume in which it appeared and the number, the date in which it appeared, and the page ranges on which it appears within that first container. At the end of the container, a period indicates that I have concluded my description of that container. Subsequently, my second container, JSTOR, is offered, again italicized, and again followed by a comma to indicate that there's more information about this container. Here again, I've provided a location, in this instance the DOI, although for other containers you may want to use and you may need to use a stable URL. At the end of the second container, like the end of the first container, there's a period. I have no additional containers in this instance, so that's the end of my Works Cited page. The last thing I want to do is format this document according to MLA guidelines. Times New Roman, size 12, which it already has done for me. In this instance, you can right-click and go to the paragraph menu. You can use the format menu if you're on a Mac to go directly to the same menu. If you're on a PC, there's usually a little arrow at the bottom of this menu right here on the Home tab that will take you also to the Paragraph menu. However you get there, the Paragraph menu should look like this. You'll want to make sure it's left aligned and that there's no special indentation on the left or right. Instead, you're going to do a special indentation here called hanging indent, as opposed to the first line indent you'll use for the paragraphs in the rest of your essay. There should be no spacing before or after the paragraph, but your line spacing overall should be double. If I click OK, my first word of my entry should be aligned to the left, and the second line should be indented about a ½ inch, which won't look right in this video. It won't make sense if you're just doing 1 or 2 entries, even for this essay if you're doing 5. But the reason we do this is because in a longer work with more sources, it makes it much easier to skim through the sources and to identify the particular ones that someone is looking for if they're following an in-text parenthetical citation and trying to find more details about the source. A special tip I'll give you at the end here is that if you have multiple sources, which I don't today, you can highlight all the paragraphs in your Works Cited entry, and every Microsoft Word page will have this wonderful button up here called A to Z, which will alphabetize your paragraphs from A to Z so that you don't have to do that for yourself. If you choose to do this, watch out because it will alphabetize quotation marks and other punctuation symbols at the beginning of the alphabet, and you'll have to put them back in manually. So, when you finish your Works Cited page, it should look like this, probably times 5. I haven't covered every database, and I haven't talked about some other types of citations that are also available to be examined. There are great resources in your Little Brown Handbook, or if you happen to have a full copy of the MLA Handbook if you're not in my class and you don't have access to the Little Brown. So I would recommend looking up particular types of sources in the index and using the Little Brown templates if you're confused. However, you can also contact me if you have questions about this assignment. Have a wonderful day.